The chapel of Santa Lucia had stood for 400 years on the hill above the river, and in all that time it had never smelled like blood. Damiano Russo pressed his palm against the cold stone of the catacomb wall and tried not to think about that fact, tried not to think about anything except the rhythm of his own breathing, ragged and shallow, each inhale dragging fire through the hole in his side. He had been shot 3 times in his life. This was the first time he thought it might actually kill him. Behind him, somewhere in the dark warren of tunnels that ran beneath the old convent, he could still hear the echo of gunfire, though it had been hours since the last shot. The sound lived in his skull now, a phantom rhythm that wouldn't leave. 12 men. He had walked into that warehouse with 12 men he trusted with his life, men whose fathers had served his father, men who had eaten at his table and sworn blood oaths beneath the Russo crest. 11 of them were dead. The 12th had put a bullet in his side and smiled while he did it. Salvatore. The name tasted like ash. His own underboss, his own blood, in the way that mattered more than DNA, forged in fire, in war, in a decade of building something out of the ashes of his father's empire. And Salvatore Greco had sold him to the Moretti syndicate for a price Damiano didn't even want to know, because knowing would only make the betrayal sharper, and right now, sharp was the last thing he needed. He needed dull. He needed dark. He needed somewhere to bleed quietly until either his body healed or it didn't. The tunnel forked ahead of him, one path curving toward what looked like an old wine cellar, the other narrowing into blackness. He chose the dark, because the dark didn't ask questions, and stumbled forward with one hand braced against stone and the other pressed to the wound at his ribs, feeling the warm seep of blood through his ruined shirt. He had grown up on stories of this place. His grandmother used to cross herself whenever they drove past Santa Lucia, mumbling about the war, about the nuns who had hidden partisans in tunnels beneath the convent when the Germans came through the valley. Holy ground, she called it. Even the devil himself would think twice before bleeding on holy ground. Damiano almost laughed, except laughing hurt too much. He didn't believe in holy ground. He didn't believe in much of anything except the cold mathematics of power. Who had it? Who wanted it? Who was willing to spill enough blood to take it? God had never once answered a prayer in his life, not when his father was dying of cancer in a hospital bed, not when his mother lit candles every night for 10 years, asking for a miracle that never came. So no. He didn't believe this stone would save him, but it would hide him. That was enough. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, and his knees finally gave out. He went down hard against the packed earth floor, the impact tearing a groan from somewhere deep in his chest, and for a long moment he simply lay there in the dark, listening to his own heartbeat slow and stutter, wondering with a strange, distant calm whether this was where it ended. Not in a blaze of glory. Not even in his own bed. In a forgotten hole beneath a church he'd never once prayed in, bleeding out next to a stack of broken wine barrels and 300 years of dust. He thought, absurdly, of his mother's rosary, the one she'd pressed into his hand the day she died, the one he'd thrown into the Tiber a week later in a fit of rage he'd never quite forgiven himself for. He thought he could use it now. Not to pray, just to hold something. Footsteps. His whole body went rigid, every instinct screaming through the haze of blood loss. He fumbled for the gun at his waistband, fingers slick and clumsy, and managed to get it half raised before the light came. Not the harsh white beam of a tactical flashlight, not the kind of light men carried when they were hunting him, but soft, warm, flickering candlelight. A figure stepped into the chamber, and Damiano's mind, fogged with pain and blood loss, took a moment to process what he was seeing. A woman in a long black habit, white wimple framing a face that seemed carved from some impossibly soft marble, dark eyes wide with shock above the candle she held aloft. A nun, of course. He'd crawled into a convent to die, and God, if God existed, if God had any sense of irony at all, had sent an angel to watch him do it. "Don't move," she whispered, though he had no intention of moving, couldn't have if he tried. Her voice trembled, but beneath the fear there was something else, something steadier. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you're bleeding so much." "Going to die anyway," he managed, the words slurring at the edges. "Doesn't matter." "It matters to me," she said, and set the candle down with hands that shook only slightly before kneeling at his side, heedless of the blood soaking into the black wool of her habit. "Hold still, please. Just hold still." He should have told her to run. He should have warned her that the men hunting him would burn this entire convent to the ground if they thought it would flush him out, that helping him was a death sentence wrapped in good intentions. He should have done 100 things that a better man would have done. Instead, as her hands pressed against the wound at his side, warm and sure despite their trembling, he found himself looking up into her face, into eyes the colour of strong coffee lit gold by candlelight, and thinking, with the last clear thought before the darkness finally took him, that he had never in his life seen anything so terrifyingly beautiful. The world went black. The last thing he heard was her voice, low and fierce, speaking words he didn't recognize as prayer until much later, when he had time to understand what it meant that a woman who didn't yet know his name had already begun praying for his soul. Sister Maria Elena Moretti had taken her temporary vows 18 months ago, had spent every day since preparing her heart for the moment, now only 6 weeks away, when she would kneel before the altar of Santa Lucia and bind herself to God forever. She had imagined every possible obstacle to that future: doubt, loneliness, the ache of a world she was choosing to leave behind. She had never imagined a dying man bleeding out on the floor of the old wine cellar beneath the convent's east wing. And yet here she was, hours after finding him, kneeling beside a stranger whose blood had stained her hands a deep, accusing red, watching his chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven breaths by the light of 3 stolen candles. She had not told Mother Superior. That fact alone sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy with the weight of every lie she had never told before. Sister Elena did not lie. She had built her entire life around the principle of truth. Truth to God, truth to her conscience, truth to the small, devoted community that had raised her since she was 8 years old, when her father had brought her to Santa Lucia's doors and asked the sisters to give her the childhood his calling could no longer provide. But she had looked at this man, this stranger soaked in blood, 3 gunshot wounds carved into a body that looked like it had been built for violence and used for nothing else. And something in her had refused to walk away and report him. Something had insisted, with a certainty she didn't fully understand, that whatever waited for him outside these walls was worse than whatever sin she might be committing by hiding him within them. She had stitched the worst of the wounds herself, using the small medical kit kept in the infirmary for minor injuries, cuts, burns, the occasional broken bone from a sister slipping on the chapel's worn stone steps. Nothing in that kit had prepared her for a bullet wound, and her hands had shaken so badly during the first stitch that she'd had to stop, breathe, recite the Hail Mary 3 times before she trusted herself to continue. He had not woken during any of it. She was grateful for that, at least. Grateful she hadn't had to look into his eyes while she dug a bullet fragment out of muscle and sinew. Grateful she hadn't had to explain herself to a man who was, by every indication of his clothing, his bearing, even the gun she had found and hidden beneath a loose floor stone, exactly the kind of man the church had spent centuries warning her about. He was beautiful, in the way that dangerous things were sometimes beautiful. Dark hair, longer than fashion dictated, damp now with sweat, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. Even unconscious, even grey with blood loss, there was an arrogance to the set of his mouth, as if his body refused to surrender its pride even when everything else had been stripped away. She made herself look away from his face and focus instead on the wound at his side, checking the bandage for the 3rd time in an hour, watching for the spreading darkness that would mean infection, mean she had not done enough, mean she would have a man's death on her conscience for the rest of whatever life she had left to live. "You're a fool, Elena," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible even in the chamber's silence. A fool, and worse. The convent bells rang for vespers somewhere above her, muffled by stone and earth, and she startled at the sound, suddenly aware of how long she had been gone, how Sister Agnes would be looking for her, how questions would start to form if she didn't appear soon with some plausible explanation for her absence. She rose, smoothing down her habit with hands that still trembled, and looked down once more at the stranger she had chosen, for reasons she could not fully name, to save. "I don't know who you are," she murmured, "or what you've done to be hunted the way you clearly are. But you are in God's house now, whether you believe in him or not. And I think—" She paused, surprised by her own words, even as she spoke them. "I think he brought you here for a reason. I have to believe that. I have to believe there's a reason for everything, even this." She left 2 more candles burning low in iron sconces, left water and clean cloth within easy reach should he wake before she returned, and climbed the narrow stairs back toward the convent proper, already composing the lie she would tell when Sister Agnes asked where she had been. A lie that tasted like betrayal on her tongue, and yet, strangely, did not feel like one. That night, kneeling in her narrow cell for evening prayers, Sister Elena found that the words came slower than usual, her mind drifting again and again to a stranger's face, to the rough, dangerous beauty of him, to the question she could not stop asking herself: what kind of man finds his way into the heart of a place built entirely on mercy? And what does it mean that mercy was the very first thing she offered him? She did not have an answer. She only knew that for the first time in 18 months of devoted, unwavering faith, she had done something she could not bring herself to confess. He woke to pain first, then to the smell of beeswax and old stone, and finally to the realization that he was not, in fact, dead. Damiano lay still for a long moment, cataloguing his body the way he'd learned to do after every previous time he'd taken a bullet. testing the edges of the wound at his ribs, the duller ache at his shoulder, the throb behind his eyes that suggested significant blood loss. He was alive. Someone had stitched him, bandaged him, laid him on what felt like a folded wool blanket instead of bare earth. Someone had saved him. He remembered her then, the candlelight, the wide, dark eyes, the white wimple framing a face too soft and too sad to belong to anyone who had chosen to live her life in service to a god Damiano had spent 34 years actively disbelieving. A nun. He had been saved by a nun, in a chamber beneath a convent, and the absurdity of it would have made him laugh if laughing didn't feel like being stabbed all over again. Footsteps on the stairs. He went still, instinct flooding back even through the fog of pain, and his hand moved automatically toward where his gun should have been, only to find it gone. He swore under his breath, a vicious, low litany of curses that died the moment candlelight spilled into the chamber, and she appeared again, this time carrying a small basket alongside the candle. Her expression caught somewhere between relief and wariness when she saw his eyes open. "You're awake," she said, and something in her voice, surprise maybe, or simple human concern, caught him off guard. "Where's my gun?" he said, instead of "thank you," instead of any of the things a decent man might have said. She set the basket down with deliberate care, not flinching at his tone. "Hidden. Somewhere you won't find it without my help. I wasn't about to leave a loaded weapon next to an unconscious man, even one I'd just spent 2 hours trying to keep from bleeding to death." He studied her in the candlelight, really studied her this time, beyond the haze of near death. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 24, 25, with a face that held none of the practiced serenity he associated with older religious women, the kind who'd had decades to smooth their features into something untouchable. Hers was still soft with feeling, still capable of fear and frustration, and, he noted with interest, a flash of irritation at his rudeness. "You should have left me to die," he said. "Would have saved you a world of trouble." "That wasn't my decision to make." She moved closer, kneeling to check his bandages with the same brisk efficiency he imagined she brought to every task, sacred or mundane. "Whatever you've done, whoever you are, I wasn't going to let a man bleed out in front of me when I had the means to stop it. That's not how I was raised." "How were you raised? To save every gutter rat who crawls into your basement?" "To believe every life has value," she said simply. And something in the directness of it landed harder than he expected, lodging beneath his ribs in a place that had nothing to do with the bullet wound. "Even yours, apparently. Though I confess you're testing that belief rather quickly." Despite himself, despite the pain and the fury still simmering at the edges of his thoughts, Salvatore's betrayal, the 11 dead men whose faces he could not stop seeing, Damiano felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "You've got a mouth on you for a nun. And you've got a mouth on you for a man who owes me his life," she countered, and there was steel under the softness, a backbone he hadn't expected. "What's your name?" He considered lying, considered telling her nothing at all, walling himself off the way he had with everyone since the day his father died and left him an empire of knives disguised as family. But something about the chamber, the candlelight, the silence, the strange, suspended unreality of the whole situation, loosened his tongue in a way it hadn't been loosened in years. "Damiano," he said. Damiano Russo. If the name meant anything to her, she didn't show it, and he found himself oddly disappointed, then immediately furious at himself for the disappointment. Of course she didn't know him. She'd spent her life in this stone fortress of prayer and silence, untouched by the world he'd built from blood and fear. Why would she know the name of a man whose own city trembled at the mention of it? "Sister Elena," she said, "and you're going to stay very still while I check this wound, Damiano Russo, unless you'd like to undo all the work I put in last night." He let her work in silence after that, watching her face in the candlelight, noting the careful concentration in her dark eyes, the way her lips pressed thin with focus when she adjusted his bandage. There was something maddening about her composure, about the absolute lack of fear in a woman who had every reason to be terrified of him, of what he was, of what his presence in her sanctuary might bring crashing down on all of them. "You should be afraid of me," he said quietly, almost against his will. She looked up, met his eyes without flinching. "Should I?" "I've killed more men than you've prayed for. I'm not a good man, sister. I'm not even close." Something passed across her face, not fear, but a kind of sorrow, gentle and unhurried, the kind he imagined she reserved for the truly lost. "I didn't ask if you were good," she said. "I asked if I should be afraid. Those aren't the same question." He had no answer for that. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Damiano Russo found himself entirely without words, watching a young woman in a nun's habit tend his wounds with hands that trembled only slightly, and feeling something dangerous stir beneath the pain. Something that felt terrifyingly like the first crack in a wall he'd spent his whole life building. 3 days passed in the rhythm of secrets. Sister Elena learned the schedule of the convent better than she ever had in 18 months of living within its walls, learned exactly how many minutes she could disappear during the gap between lauds and breakfast, exactly which corridor Sister Agnes patrolled during the quiet hour after lunch, exactly how to carry bread and broth and clean linens beneath her habit's wide sleeves without anyone noticing the bulk of what she smuggled. She told herself it was mercy. She told herself every single time guilt rose hot and sour in her throat that Christ himself had dined with sinners, had touched lepers, had forgiven the very men who nailed him to the cross, and if that was the standard she had vowed to live by, then surely tending one wounded, blasphemous Mafia boss in the bowels of her convent could not be the gravest sin imaginable. But she knew, in the small, honest corner of her heart she could not quite silence, that mercy was not the only thing drawing her back to that chamber 3 times a day. "You're staring again," Damiano said on the 3rd evening, not opening his eyes, as if he could feel the weight of her gaze even through closed lids. He was healing faster than she'd expected, the wound at his ribs closing clean, the colour returning to his face, the dangerous vitality of him reasserting itself with every hour that passed. "I'm checking your fever," she said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. "You don't need to put a hand on my forehead for that. You've been doing it for 2 minutes. Heat crept up her neck. She withdrew her hand quickly, busying herself instead with the bandage at his shoulder, refusing to look at the small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Perhaps I simply don't trust your word on your own condition. Men like you tend to lie about weakness." "Men like me," he repeated, and there was an edge to it now, something colder. "You don't know anything about men like me, sister. I know you killed 11 men's worth of grief into the world before you ever crawled into my convent," she said, and watched something flicker across his face, surprise, maybe, that she'd guessed at the shape of what had happened to him, even without details. I know you speak of God only to mock him. I know your hands have done things I cannot imagine, and yet I have touched them every day for 3 days now, and I am still here. Why? The question came out rougher than he intended, she could tell, stripped of his usual armor of mockery. Why are you still here? You could report me, hand me over to whoever's looking. You'd be a hero to your church, probably. Saint Helena, who caught the devil in her basement. Is that what you think you are? The devil? He didn't answer right away, and in the silence she found herself studying him again. Not his wounds this time, but the man beneath them. The hard lines of his face, softened slightly by exhaustion. The dark eyes that watched her with an intensity that should have frightened her, and instead made something low in her stomach turn warm and strange. I think, he said finally, that I stopped believing in devils a long time before I started believing in myself as one. I just do what needs doing. Whoever I have to be to survive, I become. There's no devil in that. There's no anything in that. Just math. That's a lonely kind of math, she said softly. Loneliness is a luxury for men who can afford to feel things. He turned his head then, finally meeting her eyes directly, and the intensity of it made her breath catch despite herself. What about you, sister? You're about to lock yourself away forever, give up every choice you might have made, every person you might have loved, every life you might have lived. Doesn't that frighten you? It's not a locking away, she said, though the question had landed somewhere tender, somewhere she hadn't expected him to find so quickly. It's a choosing. I'm choosing God above all else. There's no loss in that, only purpose. Pretty words. His voice had gone low, almost gentle, which was somehow more dangerous than his mockery had been. But you hesitated before you said them. I heard it. You're imagining things. I don't imagine. I observe. It's how I've stayed alive this long. He shifted, wincing slightly at the movement, but his eyes never left hers. You hesitated, Elena, because some part of you isn't as certain as you want me to believe, and that part of you is the only honest thing you've said to me since you found me bleeding on your floor. She rose abruptly, gathering the basin of water and bloodied cloths with hands that were not quite steady, retreating toward the stairs before he could see how thoroughly his words had unsettled her, before he could witness the truth she could not yet admit even to herself, that somewhere in 3 days of stolen visits, of careful conversation in candle-lit dark, a crack had opened in the certainty she had spent her whole life building, and a dangerous, beautiful, broken man was the one who had found it. Get some rest, she said at the doorway, refusing to look back. You'll need your strength if you mean to keep tormenting me with questions I have no intention of answering. His low laugh followed her up the stairs, and she carried the sound of it with her through the rest of the evening, through Compline and the long silence of the great silence that followed, through every prayer she tried and failed to focus fully upon, until she finally admitted to herself, lying awake in her narrow cell long after the convent had gone dark, that Damiano Russo had asked her a question she could not stop turning over in her mind. What if the hesitation he'd heard in her voice wasn't doubt about God at all, but doubt about whether the life she'd chosen had ever truly been a choice in the first place? Salvatore Greco did not like loose ends, and Damiano Russo was the loosest end of his career. He stood now in what had once been Damiano's office, the penthouse suite atop the Rousseau Tower, all glass and dark marble, and a view of the city that had taken 3 generations to claim, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man finally sitting in the chair he'd coveted for 15 years. The satisfaction would be complete, he reminded himself, the moment he had confirmation that Damiano was dead. "Nothing," said Carmine, his lieutenant, standing uneasily near the door. "No body, no sighting." He went into that warehouse district and disappeared like smoke. Men don't disappear like smoke, Carmine. Men disappear because someone is hiding them. Salvatore turned from the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass. A heavier, older face than Damiano's, lined with the particular bitterness of a man who had spent his whole career one step behind another man's shadow. Search everything within a 10-mile radius, hospitals, clinics, doctors who might owe favours. He took 3 bullets. He's not walking around on his own. And if he is dead? If he crawled off somewhere to bleed out alone? Then I want the body. I want it on the evening news. I want every family in this city to see Damiano Rousseau's corpse and understand that the old guard is finished. Salvatore's voice hardened. Until I see that body, Carmine, he's alive. And alive means dangerous. Find him. What Salvatore did not say, what he barely allowed himself to think, even alone, was the deeper fear gnawing beneath his ambition. That Damiano Rousseau had survived worse than this before. Had survived an assassination attempt at 19 that killed his own father. Had clawed his way back from a near-fatal car bombing at 26 that left 3 of his enemies dead within the month. Damiano did not die easily, and a man who did not die easily was a man who eventually returned to collect his due. Salvatore had moved against him, not because he was confident he would win in a fair fight, but because he knew, with the particular clarity of long resentment, that there would never be a fair fight with Damiano Rousseau. The man had been born holding all the cards, the name, the legacy, the loyalty his father had spent 30 years cultivating, while Salvatore had spent his entire life clawing for scraps of respect from men who would always see him as the help, never the family. The purge had been calculated, brutal, and, Salvatore believed, nearly perfect. 11 men dead in a single night, the entire inner circle of the Rousseau organization decapitated in one strike, and Damiano himself shot 3 times at close range. The only failure had been the body. Without the body, the families would not fully believe the throne had changed hands. Without the body, there would always be the possibility, however small, of return. "There's something else," Carmine said carefully. "Cardinal Befani's people reached out this morning." Salvatore's expression shifted, the satisfaction of his new throne giving way to something more cautious. The cardinal's involvement in the Rousseau family's affairs had always been the kind of secret that required careful handling, decades of laundered donations flowing through Vatican accounts, properties quietly transferred, debts forgiven in exchange for influence that reached all the way to the College of Cardinals. It had been Damiano's father who first cultivated that relationship, and Damiano himself who had maintained it, however reluctantly, understanding its value even as he privately despised the hypocrisy of men who claimed to serve God while serving the highest bidder. What do they want? Reassurance that the arrangement continues, that whatever happened in that warehouse doesn't disrupt the flow of— Carmine hesitated. The flow of funds. Salvatore allowed himself a thin smile. Tell the Cardinal's people that nothing has changed, except the name at the top of the ledger. The arrangement continues. It simply continues with me now, instead of him. After Carmine left, Salvatore stood alone at the window for a long while, watching the city lights flicker against the coming dusk, turning over the only piece of information that genuinely worried him. Damiano had vanished in the warehouse district, less than 3 miles from the old convent of Santa Lucia, a property the Russo family had quietly funded for generations as part of the very arrangement with Cardinal Bafani that Carmine had just described. It was, Salvatore thought, exactly the kind of place a desperate, bleeding man might think to hide. Holy ground, untouchable by the old superstitions Damiano's grandmother had instilled in him, by the political delicacy of raiding a convent that funneled money to one of the church's most powerful cardinals. He picked up his phone and made one more call. "I want eyes on Santa Lucia," he said when the line connected. "Quietly, no raids, nothing that draws attention, just eyes. If Damiano Russo crawled into that convent to die, I want to know the moment he crawls back out." He hung up, satisfaction and unease warring in his chest in equal measure, and turned back to the window, to the city he had just claimed, wondering with a cold certainty he could not quite shake whether he had truly won the war or simply postponed its bloodiest chapter. By the end of the first week, Damiano could stand without his vision greying at the edges, could walk the length of the small chamber without his breath catching on fire, and the restlessness of recovery had begun to gnaw at him in ways the pain never had. He had spent his entire adult life in motion, deals, threats, the constant calculus of power that demanded he always be 3 steps ahead of whoever wanted to take what he'd built. Stillness, he was discovering, was its own particular torture, made worse by the fact that his only company in that stillness was a woman who occupied more of his thoughts than he was comfortable admitting. Elena came twice daily now, sometimes 3 times, and he had begun, despite every instinct screaming against it, to look forward to the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, the way a man looked forward to the only good thing in an otherwise ruined day. "You're different than I expected," he told her one afternoon, watching her change the dressing on his shoulder with hands that had grown steadier with practice. "Most women raised the way you were raised, sheltered, devout. They flinch from men like me. You don't flinch at all." "Should I?" "Most do." She considered this, her fingers pausing against the bandage. "I think fear is often just unfamiliarity wearing a more respectable name. I'm not unfamiliar with suffering, Damiano. I grew up in a place built entirely around tending wounds, physical, spiritual, every kind there is. Yours aren't so different from what I've seen before." "I doubt that." He watched her face carefully. "What kind of wounds does a convent see exactly? Paper cuts from prayer books?" A flash of something crossed her face, old grief carefully banked. "My mother died when I was 8. My father brought me here because he had no other way to raise a daughter and answer the calling he'd received at the same time. The sisters who took me in had seen every kind of loss imaginable by the time I arrived. Women who'd lost husbands to violence, children to illness, their own faith to despair. I learned to tend wounds because I was raised in a house built from other people's grief, long before I ever tended yours." Something in her voice, the specific, careful way she described her father's calling, caught at him, though he couldn't immediately place why. He let it pass for now, filing it away the way he filed every piece of information, useful or not. "Your father's a priest?" "Was, a small, complicated smile. He's risen rather further than that now. He didn't press, sensing the boundary in her tone, and instead found himself asking the question that had actually been gnawing at him since the conversation began. Did it work? Tending other people's wounds? Growing up in a house of grief? Did it heal you, or just teach you to ignore your own? Her hands stilled completely this time. She looked up at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Something raw, something unguarded, the kind of look that made him feel, absurdly, like he'd stumbled onto sacred ground he had no right to walk on. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I've never let myself ask that question before you asked it for me." "Maybe you should. Maybe you should mind your own wounds and leave mine alone," she said. But there was no real heat in it, only a kind of tired honesty that made him want, suddenly and fiercely, to reach out and touch her face, to trace the line of worry between her brows with a thumb gentler than anything he'd used in years. He didn't. He held himself still, the way he'd learned to hold himself still through years of negotiations where the wrong movement could mean death, and instead said, "Fair enough, sister." But the moment lingered between them long after she finished the bandage and rose to leave, and Damiano found himself alone again in the candle-lit dark, turning her words over and over. "I've never let myself ask that question before," and recognizing, with a discomfort he hadn't felt in years, the particular shape of a woman who had spent her entire life giving herself away to everyone but herself. It should not have mattered to him. He had no business caring about the architecture of Sister Elena's heart, no business wondering whether her devotion was a calling freely chosen or a cage she'd been raised inside of without ever knowing another way to live. He had his own war to return to, the moment his body allowed it, his own throne to reclaim, his own blood debt to collect from Salvatore Greco's treacherous hide. And yet, lying in the dark of a chamber built to hide saints and sinners alike, Damiano Russo found himself praying, for the first time since his mother's death, not to a God he didn't believe in, but to whatever force had brought him bleeding to this particular convent on this particular night, into the path of this particular woman. "Let me have more time," he thought, surprising himself with the desperation of it. "Just a little more time before the world finds me and takes this away." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a Vatican courier in plain clothes, who handed it directly to Mother Superior with instructions that it reach Sister Elena before the day's end. Elena recognized her father's handwriting immediately, the elegant, careful script he'd cultivated over decades of writing homilies, encyclicals, and now the weighty pronouncements of his office, and her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal in the privacy of her cell. "My dearest Elena, I write to you with a heart full of both pride and longing. In 6 weeks you will take your final vows, and I confess I find myself overwhelmed at the thought of the woman you have become, the woman your mother would be so proud of, the woman I know God has called to a life of profound service. I had hoped to be present in person to discuss the arrangements for the ceremony, but matters here demand my attention, as they always seem to. I have asked Cardinal Befani to visit Santa Lucia in my stead, to ensure all preparations meet the dignity the occasion deserves. I trust you will extend him every courtesy, though I know your relationship with the Cardinal has not always been the warmest. Elena, I want you to know that whatever choice you make in these final weeks, I will love you no less. The vows you take should come from certainty, not obligation. Not even, I confess, obligation to me or to the position I now hold. I became a priest after your mother's death because I believed it was the only way I could survive my grief and still serve a purpose larger than my own pain. You do not need the same wound to justify the same calling. I pray every single day that your choice comes from love and not from loss. Your devoted father, Adrian. She read the letter 3 times, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed long after the convent bells had rung for the hour, feeling something in her chest twist tighter with each pass over her father's words. I pray your choice comes from love and not from loss. He had no way of knowing how precisely the question cut, no way of knowing that for the first time in 18 months of unwavering certainty, she had begun to wonder if her devotion had ever been entirely her own. She thought of her father often, Pope Adrian VII, the man the world now called Holy Father, who had once simply been Father Antonio Moretti, a young priest grieving a wife he'd loved with his whole soul, raising a daughter he could not bear to lose, even as his calling pulled him deeper into the Church's highest offices. He had given her to Santa Lucia not out of abandonment, she knew, but out of love so fierce it had frightened him. The fear that his own grief might poison her childhood if he tried to raise her alone. The belief that the sisters could give her a stability and faith he was too broken to provide. She had grown up believing his sacrifice and her own calling were the same shape, cut from the same cloth of devotion. Now, with a man's voice echoing in her thoughts, "You hesitated, Eleanor, because some part of you isn't as certain as you want me to believe." She found herself questioning, for the first time, whether she had ever truly chosen this life, or simply inherited it. She folded the letter carefully and made her way down to the chamber beneath the convent later that evening, carrying bread and the weight of a question she hadn't intended to ask aloud. "You're quiet tonight," Damiano observed, watching her from where he sat propped against the stone wall, far stronger now than he'd been even a few days before. "Something's wrong." "My father wrote to me," she said, setting down the basket with more force than necessary. "About my final vows, about choosing freely." "And did you?" His voice was careful, watchful. "Choose freely?" "I was 8 years old when I came to live here, Damiano. I don't know what a free choice even looks like for someone who's never known another life to choose from." The honesty of it surprised her, even as she said it, the words tumbling out faster than she could moderate them. "Everyone tells me this is my calling. My father believes it, Mother Superior believes it, I believed it. For 18 months I have believed it completely, and now you've met a man who makes you doubt it," he finished. And there was no triumph in his voice, only a strange, quiet gravity that surprised her more than mockery would have. "Now I've met a man who asks questions I should never have let myself consider," she corrected. "That's not the same as doubting my calling. That's simply becoming aware that the calling has never been tested before. A faith untested isn't faith at all. It's just inheritance. And if it fails the test, then I suppose I'll learn something true about myself, even if it's painful." She met his eyes, steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Who is your father, Damiana? Who taught you to become the man you are?" Something dark passed across his face. "My father taught me that power is the only language the world actually speaks. Everything else, love, faith, mercy, is just decoration people use to make the language sound prettier. He died believing it. I've spent 15 years proving him right. That sounds like a very lonely inheritance. It is. He looked at her then, with an intensity that made her breath catch. But you're the first person in a long time who's made me wonder if he might have been wrong. The words hung between them, heavy and dangerous, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, not the comfortable certainty of faith, but something wilder, something that frightened her precisely because it felt, for the first time in her devoted life, entirely her own. Cardinal Befani arrived at Santa Lucia on a grey Thursday morning, his black sedan crawling up the convent's gravel drive with the particular ostentation of a man who enjoyed being seen even when humility was the occasion's stated purpose. Mother Superior received him in the small parlour reserved for important visitors. The room's austere furnishings, a single wooden table, 2 chairs, a faded tapestry of the Annunciation, doing little to dim the cardinal's evident sense of his own importance. His Holiness asked me to personally ensure the preparations for Sister Elena's final vows meet appropriate dignity, Befani said, accepting tea he did not particularly want, his eyes moving around the room with the assessing quality of a man who had spent decades learning to read value in unlikely places. It is no small thing to have the Holy Father's own daughter take her vows in such a humble setting. Some have suggested a more prominent ceremony, perhaps in Rome itself. Sister Elena has expressed a clear preference to take her vows here, among the sisters who raised her, Mother Superior said, her tone carrying the particular firmness of a woman who had run her convent for 30 years and answered to very few earthly authorities. I would not see that preference overruled for the sake of spectacle. Of course, of course. Befani's smile did not reach his eyes. I merely raised the possibility for consideration. What he did not say, what he had no intention of saying to Mother Superior or anyone else within these walls, was the second purpose of his visit, confirming with his own eyes whether the rumours reaching him through certain less holy channels held any truth. Rumours of a wounded man seen fleeing toward the convent's grounds the night of the warehouse massacre. Rumours that Salvatore Greco's men were watching Santa Lucia with an interest that had nothing to do with religious devotion. The arrangement between the Church, or more precisely between Cardinal Befani's particular sphere of influence within it, and the Russo crime family, had been in place for nearly 3 decades. A quiet river of laundered funds flowing from criminal enterprise into charitable foundations, restoration projects, and discreet personal accounts that had elevated Befani from a minor provincial bishop to one of the most powerful men in the College of Cardinals. The arrangement had survived Damiano's father's death. It had survived Damiano's own ascension. Befani had no particular loyalty to either Russo or Greco. His loyalty extended only as far as the money continued to flow, and he intended to ensure it continued flowing regardless of which man's name sat atop the family's ledgers. But a war between Russo and Greco threatened that stability in ways that troubled him deeply, and the possibility that Damiano Russo, gravely wounded, hunted, desperate, might have taken refuge somewhere within Santa Lucia's grounds, represented a complication Befani had no intention of allowing to spiral beyond his control. "I should like to walk the grounds before I leave," he said, setting down his tea with practiced casualness. "It has been some years since I last saw the full property. I understand there are tunnels beneath the older sections, remnants of the war, I believe. Something flickered in Mother Superior's expression, wariness, perhaps, though carefully concealed. The tunnels are unstable in places, Your Eminence. I would not advise merely a brief tour. I have a particular interest in the convent's history. His smile sharpened slightly. Surely you would not deny a cardinal's modest request. She could not, of course, and Befani knew it, knew the precise weight his title carried, even within a community as devoted to its own autonomy as Santa Lucia's sisters had always been. They walked the grounds together for nearly an hour, Mother Superior offering increasingly strained commentary on the chapel's medieval frescoes, the convent's original foundations, the small cemetery where generations of sisters lay buried beneath simple stone markers, all while carefully, deliberately steering him away from the entrance to the lower tunnels that Befani had specifically come to find. He noted her evasion. He noted, too, the particular tension in her shoulders, the careful brightness of her voice whenever the conversation drifted too close to the convent's older, hidden architecture. Whether she knew something specific or simply suspected, Befani could not yet determine, but the wariness itself told him something worth knowing. He left Santa Lucia an hour later with no concrete proof of anything, but with a suspicion sharpening into near certainty. Something was being hidden beneath that convent, and given the timing, given the rumours, given Mother Superior's carefully managed evasion, Befani would have wagered a significant sum that the something in question wore the shape of Damiano Russo. In his car, pulling away down the gravel drive, he made a single phone call. "It's Befani," he said when the line connected. "I need to know what Salvatore Greco's people have found, if anything, regarding Damiano Russo's whereabouts. And I need to know discreetly. The last thing any of us need is a war breaking out across consecrated ground. The optics alone would be a catastrophe I have no intention of managing." He ended the call and settled back against the leather seat, watching the convent recede in the rearview mirror, already calculating the dozen ways this complication might be turned to his advantage rather than allowed to become a liability. Behind him, inside the convent's walls, Mother Superior stood at the window of her office, watching the cardinal's car disappear down the drive with an unease she could not quite name. Wondering, not for the first time in recent days, exactly what Sister Elena had been hiding during her increasingly frequent, increasingly unexplained absences from the convent's daily rhythms. Mother Superior found her opportunity 3 days later, catching Sister Elena alone in the convent's small herb garden during the quiet hour after lunch, when most of the sisters retreated to private contemplation or simple rest. "Sister Elena?" The older woman's voice carried no anger, only a weariness that somehow felt heavier than anger would have. "Walk with me." Elena's heart lurched, though she kept her expression carefully neutral as she fell into step beside Mother Superior, along the garden's narrow gravel path, lined with rosemary and lavender, gone slightly wild in the late spring warmth. "You've been distracted lately," Mother Superior said. "Distant, I've noticed it, even if I haven't spoken of it before now. Your absences have grown longer. Your attention during prayer has wandered in ways I've never observed from you before." "I'm sorry, Mother. I've had—" Elena hesitated, the lie forming and dying on her tongue before she could give it shape. "I've had a great deal on my mind, with the final vows approaching." "That's understandable. It would be strange if you didn't have concerns at such a threshold. Mother Superior paused beside a stone bench, settling onto it with the careful deliberateness of age, and looked up at Elena with eyes that had seen 6 decades of young women's doubts and certainties alike. But I wonder, child, if what's troubling you runs deeper than ordinary nerves. I wonder if perhaps you found yourself carrying a burden you haven't felt able to share. The directness of it nearly undid her. Elena sat slowly on the bench beside Mother Superior, hands clasped tightly in her lap, fighting the overwhelming urge to confess everything: the chamber, the wounded man, the questions he'd awakened in her that she could not silence, no matter how fervently she prayed. Mother, I am not asking you to confess sins to me, Elena. That privilege belongs to the sacrament and to Father Marco's discretion, not mine. Mother Superior's voice gentled. I am simply asking, as someone who has watched you grow from a frightened 8-year-old into a woman of remarkable faith, whether you are well, whether the path ahead still feels true to you. Elena's eyes burned with unshed tears, and she hated the weakness of it, hated that after 18 months of unwavering certainty, she found herself unable to answer a simple question without her voice threatening to break. I don't know anymore, she whispered finally, the confession costing her more than she'd expected. I thought I knew. I was so certain, Mother. And now... Now you're not. Now I'm afraid that I never truly chose this life at all. That I simply walked the only path anyone ever showed me, and called it a calling, because I had no other word for inheritance. Mother Superior was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the herb garden's wild rosemary, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Do you know what I believe, Elena? I believe God rarely announces himself with the certainty young women expect. I believe faith is built less from unwavering conviction and more from showing up, again and again, even through doubt, even through fear, until the showing up itself becomes its own form of devotion. She turned to look at Eleanor directly. The fact that you're questioning does not mean you've failed your calling. It may simply mean your calling is finally becoming real rather than inherited. And if the questioning leads me somewhere else entirely, somewhere far from these walls? Something in Mother Superior's expression sharpened, though her voice remained gentle. Is that what you fear, child? That your questioning has a particular shape, a particular cause? Elena's breath caught, the moment stretching taut between confession and concealment, and she felt, with sudden clarity, that whatever she said next would determine not just her own path, but the safety of a man whose life now rested, however unwillingly, in her hands. I fear, she said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone walking a narrow ledge, that I have spent my whole life being told what devotion should feel like, without ever testing whether what I feel matches the description. That's all, Mother. Nothing more specific than that. It was not a lie, not entirely, but it was not the whole truth either, and Elena felt the weight of that omission settle into her chest like a stone as Mother Superior studied her for a long, searching moment before finally nodding, accepting the answer, even if some deeper instinct told her it was incomplete. Pray on it, Mother Superior said finally, rising from the bench with the careful effort of age. Pray honestly, Elena, not for the answer you think you should want, but for the truth, whatever shape it takes. God is not frightened by honest doubt. He is far more troubled by performed certainty. Elena watched her walk back toward the convent's main building, the older woman's black habit moving like a shadow against the bright green of the garden, and felt the full weight of her own deception settle over her like a shroud. That evening, descending the narrow stairs toward the hidden chamber, with her usual basket of bread and clean linens, she found herself moving slower than usual, weighed down by a guilt that had nothing to do with the small lies she'd told, and everything to do with the larger truth she could no longer deny. Whatever she felt for Damiano Russo had grown beyond mercy, beyond simple compassion for a wounded stranger, into something that threatened to unmake the entire architecture of the life she'd spent 18 years building. "You look troubled," Damiano said the moment she entered the chamber, setting down a small book he'd been turning over in his hands, one of the few volumes she'd brought him during his recovery, a worn copy of Dante's Inferno that he'd found grimly appropriate given his circumstances. "Mother Superior spoke with me today," Elena admitted, setting down the basket with hands that betrayed her unsettled state. "She's noticed my absences, my distraction." His expression sharpened with immediate concern, the protective instinct surfacing before he could check it. "Does she know about me?" "No, not specifically, but she knows something is troubling me, and I—" Elena sank onto the small wooden stool she'd brought down weeks ago, her shoulders curving inward with exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "I lied to her, Damiano. Not directly, but through omission, which is its own kind of lie. I've never done that before. Not once in 18 years of living within these walls." "Welcome to the rest of us," he said, though there was no real mockery in it, only a kind of weary solidarity. "Lying's not as heavy a burden as the nuns make it sound. You get used to the weight eventually." "I don't want to get used to it." Her voice cracked slightly. "That's exactly what frightens me. I don't want lying to become something I simply carry without feeling its weight. The moment it stops feeling heavy is the moment I've lost something I can't get back." He watched her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his dark eyes. "Then maybe you should stop lying. Tell her about me. I'm strong enough to move now, strong enough to find somewhere else to disappear to. You don't have to keep carrying this for my sake." The offer surprised her, surprised them both, perhaps, given the genuine reluctance she could see warring behind his eyes even as he made it. "Is that what you want? To leave?" "What I want has stopped being relevant to my decisions for a long time, sister. I want a great many things I can't have." His voice had gone low, rougher than usual. "But I won't be the reason you compromise everything you've built here. Whatever this is, whatever's happened between us these past weeks, it's not worth the cost of your entire life's foundation." "And if I told you," Eleanor said slowly, surprising herself with the words even as she spoke them, "that I'm no longer certain my life's foundation is as solid as I once believed?" The air in the chamber seemed to still. Damiano rose from where he'd been sitting, moving toward her with the careful, deliberate steps of a man still healing, until he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Don't say things like that because of me," he said, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like warning, almost like fear. Don't let 3 weeks in a basement with a dying criminal undo 18 years of conviction. I'm not worth that, Eleanor. Whatever I've stirred up in you, it's not love. It's proximity. It's danger dressed up as feeling. It'll fade the moment I'm gone, and you'll be left having burned down your entire life for nothing. You don't get to decide what I feel, she said, and there was steel in it now, the same steel he'd noticed that very first night, before either of them understood what was beginning to grow between them. I've spent my whole life letting other people decide what I should feel, what I should want, what shape my devotion should take. I won't let you do the same, even if your intentions are kinder than theirs were. Eleanor. I'm not saying I'm leaving the convent. I'm not saying I know what any of this means. Her voice trembled, but she did not look away from him. I'm only saying that whatever I feel when I'm with you is the most honest thing I've felt in years, and I won't pretend otherwise just because it frightens you to hear it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The candlelight flickered between them, casting their shadows long against the stone walls, and Damiano felt something break loose inside his chest, some final restraint giving way beneath the weight of weeks of careful distance, of pretending he didn't watch her hands when she changed his bandages, didn't memorize the particular cadence of her voice during their late-night conversations, didn't lie awake after she left each evening, turning over every word she'd spoken, like a man starving for scraps of warmth. He reached up, slowly, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face where it had escaped her wimple, his fingers lingering against her cheek longer than necessary, longer than safe. "This is going to destroy us both," he murmured. "You understand that, don't you? Whatever this is between us, it has no future. You belong to God, and I belong to blood and fire. There's no version of this story that ends well." "I know," Eleanor whispered, and did not pull away from his touch. "I know, and I still can't make myself stop wanting to be near you. What does that say about my faith, Damiana? What does that say about me?" "It says you're human," he said softly, "just like the rest of us. Maybe that's the only honest thing either of us has discovered down here." He did not kiss her, though every instinct screamed for him to close the remaining distance between them. He simply held her face in his hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the slight tremble of her breath, and understood with absolute terrifying clarity that whatever happened next, whatever the world eventually demanded of them both, he had already fallen too far to climb back out unchanged. The discovery came not from Mother Superior's careful suspicion, nor from Cardinal Bafani's calculating investigation, but from the simplest and most dangerous source of all, a careless mistake. Sister Agnes, the convent's youngest member, besides Elena herself, had taken to delivering supplies to the lower storage rooms each Thursday, a task she performed without complaint, despite the dim lighting and persistent damp that made the older sisters avoid the chore when possible. On this particular Thursday, carrying a crate of preserved vegetables toward the wine cellar's storage shelves, she heard a sound that did not belong in an empty cellar. A low, distinctly masculine cough, muffled but unmistakable, drifting up from somewhere beyond the cellar's far wall. She set down the crate with hands that had gone suddenly cold and approached the source of the sound with the particular caution of someone who has stumbled onto something they were never meant to find. The narrow gap behind the old wine racks, the one she'd always assumed led nowhere significant, revealed itself under closer inspection to be the entrance to a passage she'd never explored, dimly lit by what looked like the glow of a candle burning somewhere deeper in the dark. She did not investigate further. Sister Agnes was young, but not foolish, and something in the particular quality of her fear told her this was knowledge that belonged immediately and without delay in Mother Superior's hands rather than her own. By the time Elena descended for her evening visit, carrying the usual basket of bread and medicine, Mother Superior was already waiting at the base of the stairs, her expression carved from a grief so profound it took Elena's breath away. "Sister Elena," Mother Superior said quietly, and the use of her full title, formal, distant, nothing like the warmth of their conversation in the herb garden days before, told Elena everything she needed to know about how thoroughly her secret had unravelled. "I think it's time you explained yourself." Elena's basket slipped from her fingers, bread tumbling across the stone floor as the full weight of discovery crashed over her. "Mother, please, let me explain." "Explain what, exactly? That you've been hiding a man, a wounded, presumably dangerous man, beneath this convent for nearly a month, lying to me, lying to your sisters, lying to God himself about the nature of your absences?" Mother Superior's voice, usually so measured, cracked with something close to anguish. "Do you have any understanding of what you've risked? Not just your own soul, child, but the safety of every woman within these walls." "I couldn't leave him to die," Elena said, the words tumbling out in desperate defence. "He came here bleeding, dying, with nowhere else to go. What would you have had me do, Mother? Turn away a dying man because helping him was inconvenient to my vows?" "I would have had you tell me," Mother Superior said, "so that the burden of that choice did not fall on your shoulders alone. So that whatever risk we chose to take, we chose it together as a community, not in secret, not built on a foundation of lies that could have destroyed everything we've built here if it had been discovered by the wrong hands instead of mine." The truth of it landed hard, and Elena felt shame rise hot in her throat, recognizing in Mother Superior's words a wisdom she'd been too frightened, too consumed by her own growing feelings to seek out herself. "Who is he?" Mother Superior asked, quieter now, though no less serious. "I need to know exactly what danger we've harboured within these walls." Elena hesitated only a moment before answering, understanding that the time for partial truths had ended. "His name is Damiano Russo. He's—" She swallowed hard. "He's the head of the Russo crime family. Or he was, before someone tried to kill him and take his place." Mother Superior's face went pale, the full magnitude of the situation settling over her features. "Dear God! Elena, do you understand what you've done? The Russo family's enemies are not the kind of men who respect consecrated ground. If they discover he's here—" "I know," Elena said softly. "I've known the danger since the first night. I chose to help him anyway." "Why?" The question carried genuine bewilderment, the kind that demanded honesty above all else. "Why would you take such a risk, Elena? Not for a stranger." There must be more to it than simple mercy. Elena's silence answered the question more thoroughly than any words could have, and she watched understanding dawn slowly across Mother Superior's weathered features. Understanding, and beneath it, a grief that cut deeper than mere disapproval. "Oh, child," Mother Superior whispered. "Oh, Elena, tell me it isn't what I think it is." I don't know what it is, Elena admitted, tears finally spilling over despite her best efforts to contain them. I only know that something has changed in me these past weeks that I cannot pray away, cannot reason away, cannot will myself back into the certainty I had before he came. I'm frightened, Mother. I'm frightened of what that means for everything I've built my life around. Mother Superior was quiet for a long moment, studying the younger woman's tear-streaked face with an expression caught somewhere between sorrow and something almost like compassion. "We will deal with the danger first," she said finally, her voice steadying with practical resolve, even as her eyes remained heavy with concern. "The man must be moved before his enemies discover this connection between him and our convent. After that—" She paused, and Elena heard the weight of unspoken worry in the silence. "After that, Elena, you and I will need to speak very seriously about what your heart has chosen, and whether that choice has any place in the life you swore to live." He was gone within 2 days, and the speed of his departure left a hollowness in Elena's chest that frightened her more than the discovery itself had. Mother Superior had arranged it with a discretion that revealed depths of resourcefulness Elena had never glimpsed in 3 decades of knowing the older woman. A contact within the local diocese who owed her a confidential favour, a private vehicle with tinted windows, false papers procured through channels Elena did not ask about and Mother Superior did not explain. By the second evening, Damiano stood at the base of the cellar stairs, dressed in plain civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise the dangerous economy of his movements, ready to disappear into a world Elena had no part of and no right to follow into. "You don't have to do this," she said, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them, knowing there was no alternative that didn't end in greater danger for everyone involved. "You're still healing." "I'm healed enough." His voice was carefully controlled, the walls she'd watched come down over weeks of careful conversation, rebuilding themselves brick by brick before her eyes. "Staying any longer puts you and every woman in this convent at risk. I won't be the reason innocent people die for my sake." "Where will you go?" "Somewhere safe. Somewhere I can plan my next move without Salvatore's men finding me first." He paused, something flickering across his face that he quickly suppressed. "It's better this way, Elena. For both of us." "Is it?" The question came out sharper than she intended, grief and fear bleeding into anger she hadn't expected to feel. "Is it better? Or is it simply easier for you to leave before either of us has to decide what we actually want?" His jaw tightened. "You're about to take final vows in 5 weeks. There was never going to be a version of this that ended any other way." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters." He stepped closer, and despite the anger simmering between them, despite the impossibility of everything they'd allowed to grow in the dark of that chamber, Elena felt her body respond to his nearness the way it always had, with a longing she'd given up trying to fully suppress. "You belong here, Elena, to this life, to this calling. Even if you're frightened of how certain you feel about it right now, I'm not going to be the reason you abandon something you've spent your whole life building just because a dying man crawled into your basement and made you doubt yourself for a few weeks. And if it's more than doubt, if what I feel for you isn't something I can simply pray away once you're gone, then you'll be stronger than I am," he said quietly. Because I already know I won't manage to pray you away, no matter how many years pass. The confession, raw and unguarded, broke something loose in both of them simultaneously. Before she could think better of it, before either of them could weigh the wisdom of the act against everything it threatened to unmake, Elena closed the remaining distance and kissed him. It was not the careful, controlled touch he'd offered weeks before, the gentle brush of fingers against her cheek. It was desperate, searching, carrying the full weight of 5 weeks of stolen glances and suppressed longing. And Damiano responded with an intensity that nearly buckled her knees. One hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressing against the small of her back, pulling her against him as if he could somehow fuse their bodies together before circumstance tore them permanently apart. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, both shaking slightly with the magnitude of what had just passed between them, Elena pressed her forehead against his chest and allowed herself, for one final moment, to simply exist within the warmth of him, without thinking about consequences, about vows, about the impossible distance between the life she'd promised to live and the man currently holding her like she was something precious enough to protect with his life. "This doesn't change anything," he murmured into her hair, though his voice carried none of the conviction the words should have held. "I still have to go. You still have your vows." "I know," she whispered back. "I know, and it doesn't make any of this hurt less." He pulled back finally, his hands lingering against her face for one last moment before he forced himself to step away, the distance between them suddenly feeling like an ocean rather than a few feet of stone floor. "If I survive what's coming," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he clearly fought to control, "I don't know what I'll do with whatever I feel for you. I've never had to figure out how to want something I can't simply take or destroy. You're the first thing in my life I don't know how to claim." "Maybe that's because some things were never meant to be claimed," Elena said softly. "Maybe some things are only ever meant to be chosen, freely, by both people, or not at all." He held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes, before finally turning toward the waiting car, toward the dangerous world that demanded his return, toward a war he had no guarantee of surviving. "Pray for me, sister," he said over his shoulder, the old mockery returning to his voice, though it no longer carried its former conviction. "God knows I could use it, whether I believe in the source or not." She watched the car disappear down the gravel drive into the darkness beyond, and felt, with a certainty that frightened her more than any doubt she'd experienced in 18 years of devoted faith, that she had just watched the truest thing she'd ever felt drive away from her, possibly forever, and that no amount of prayer would be sufficient to fill the hollow space he left behind. Salvatore Greco's empire, built on the foundation of betrayal and 11 dead men, had stood for exactly 6 weeks before its cracks began to show. Damiano watched from the shadows of an abandoned apartment 3 blocks from the Rousseau Tower, his body fully healed now, his mind sharpened by weeks of careful planning, conducted from a series of safe houses scattered across the city's less visible corners. He had spent the time well, reaching out to allies Salvatore's purge had missed, calling in decades-old favours from families who'd respected his father, slowly rebuilding the network of loyalty and information that had been his birthright before a single night of violence had nearly taken it all away. He had also spent the time thinking about Elena, far more than he'd intended to, far more than was strategically wise for a man rebuilding an empire from the ashes of betrayal. Her face surfaced in quiet moments, during long nights of planning, During the particular stillness before a meeting that might end in violence, during the rare hours of sleep that came easier when he allowed himself to remember the warmth of her hand against his fevered forehead, the steel in her voice when she'd refused to let him dictate the shape of her own feelings. He told himself repeatedly that the connection between them had been a product of circumstance, proximity, vulnerability, the strange intimacy of a deathbed confession made to a stranger who happened to be beautiful and kind. He told himself this so often that he nearly believed it, except for the moments late at night when honesty crept past his defences and reminded him that he had never, in 34 years of careful emotional armour, felt anything close to what 3 weeks in a candle-lit chamber beneath Santa Lucia had awakened in him. "The Caruso family is ready to back you," said Thomas, one of the few lieutenants who had survived Salvatore's purge by sheer luck and absence from the warehouse that night. "And the Brindisi brothers, though they want assurances about territory before they commit fully." "They'll get their assurances once Salvatore's dealt with," Damiano said, studying the building plans spread across the apartment's small table, the Russo Tower's security layout, memorized and rememorized until he could navigate it blind. "What about the Cardinal?" Thomas hesitated. "Befani's been making inquiries, quiet ones but persistent. He knows something happened at Santa Lucia, even if he doesn't have proof of what." Damiano's expression hardened. The thought of Befani's calculating interest turning toward the convent, toward Elena, sent a cold fury through him that he hadn't felt even during the worst of Salvatore's betrayal. "Make sure his inquiries lead nowhere. I don't care what it costs. The convent stays out of this entirely." "That might not be possible for much longer," Thomas said carefully. "Word is Salvatore's men have been watching Santa Lucia for weeks. If they connect you to the place, they won't." The words came out harder than intended, edged with a possessiveness that surprised even him. "I'll handle Befani and Salvatore both, but the convent does not become collateral in this war. Are we clear?" Thomas nodded, wisely choosing not to press the obvious question hanging in the room. Why a man who had spent his entire life treating sentiment as weakness suddenly cared so fiercely about protecting a religious community with no apparent connection to the family's business beyond decades of quiet financial arrangement. The plan, when it finally came together over the following days, was elegant in its brutality. Precisely the kind of strategy Damiano's father had taught him to value above all else. Salvatore had claimed the throne through betrayal. Damiano would reclaim it through revelation, exposing to the city's other families the full extent of Salvatore's treachery. The 11 men murdered not in honest war, but in cowardly ambush. The years of resentment that had curdled into an act no family with any honor could allow to stand unanswered. He called the meeting himself, using channels Salvatore couldn't trace, summoning the heads of every major family in the city to a neutral location with promises of evidence too significant to ignore. Salvatore, confident in his new throne, made the mistake of attending in person rather than sending a representative, a decision Damiano had counted on, knowing his former lieutenant's pride would never allow him to appear weak in front of his new peers. The confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its swiftness.
Damiano walked into the meeting room, flanked by Tomas and 3 other survivors of the purge, watched Salvatore's face drain of colour at the sight of him very much alive, and laid out the evidence of betrayal with the same cold precision his father had taught him to bring to every negotiation. "You killed 11 men who trusted you," Damiano said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Men who called you brother. You shot me 3 times and left me to die in a warehouse, and then you sat in my father's chair and called yourself a leader." He turned to address the assembled family heads directly. "I am not asking you to choose between Salvatore and me out of loyalty to my name. I am asking you to choose whether you want to do business with a man who proved, beyond any doubt, that he will betray anyone the moment ambition outweighs honour." Salvatore tried to speak, tried to offer some defence, but the room had already turned against him, the assembled weight of a dozen powerful men, recognizing, with the particular clarity of self-interest, that an organization led by a proven traitor offered far less stability than one led by a man who had survived betrayal and returned to claim what was rightfully his. By the end of that night, Salvatore Greco's brief reign had ended, his own bodyguards turning against him the moment the room's consensus became clear, and Damiano Russo stood once more at the head of the empire his father had built, older, scarred, fundamentally changed by what he'd survived, and haunted, more than he wanted to admit, by the absence of a dark-eyed nun who had saved his life and then, with equal certainty, sent him back into it. The convent settled into an uneasy peace in the weeks following Damiano's departure, though Elena found peace harder to manufacture in her own heart than the careful routine of convent life suggested it should be. Mother Superior had kept her promise of serious conversation, and the weeks since had been filled with long, difficult discussions in the privacy of the older woman's office. Conversations about calling, about doubt, about the particular danger of mistaking gratitude or proximity for love. Elena had listened to every counsel offered, had prayed with a fervency she hadn't managed in months, had tried with genuine effort to locate within herself the certainty that had once felt so unshakable. The certainty did not return. What returned instead, with maddening persistence, was the memory of Damiano's hands on her face, the rough honesty of his voice when he'd confessed he didn't know how to want something he couldn't simply claim. The particular ache of watching his car disappear down the gravel drive into a darkness she had no way of following him into. "You're distracted again," Sister Agnes observed one afternoon, watching Elena's hands still over the embroidery they were meant to be completing for the chapel's altar cloth. "Have been for weeks, honestly." "I'm sorry," Elena said, automatically, though the apology felt hollow even as she offered it. "I've had a great deal to think about." "About the final vows?" "Among other things." Elena set down the embroidery, unable to focus on the careful stitches when her mind insisted on wandering elsewhere. "Agnes, can I ask you something? Have you ever doubted your own calling? Not in a small way, not the ordinary doubts everyone faces, but doubted it so completely you weren't sure you recognized your own life anymore?" Sister Agnes considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I doubted before I came here, certainly. I think most of us do before we find our way to this particular life. But once I arrived, once I understood what I was choosing and why, no, I haven't doubted since. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Elena said, the lie sitting uncomfortably beside the larger lie she'd already told about Damiano, about the chamber, about everything that had transpired in the weeks of his recovery. She had told Mother Superior everything regarding the danger. She had told no one, not even in confession, the full depth of what she felt. She thought of confession often during those weeks, of the sacrament's promise of absolution, of how easily she could walk into the small wooden booth and unburden herself of every guilty thought, every memory of his hands, his mouth, the particular way he'd looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a world built entirely from shifting sand. She thought of it, and she did not do it, recognizing in her own avoidance a truth she wasn't yet ready to fully confront. She did not want absolution from feelings she could not bring herself to regret. It was Mother Superior who finally addressed the unspoken question directly, during what Elena had expected to be an ordinary check-in regarding the final vows preparation. "I received word," Mother Superior said carefully, "that Damiano Russo has reclaimed leadership of his organization. The man who betrayed him has been dealt with, and the city's underworld has apparently settled, for now, into whatever fragile peace such men manage to maintain." Elena's breath caught. "How do you know this?" "The diocese has its own channels of information, particularly regarding matters that might affect the Church's various arrangements." Mother Superior's expression carried careful neutrality. "I tell you this, not to reopen wounds you're working to heal, but because I believe you deserve to know he survived, given everything you risked to ensure that outcome." "Thank you," Elena said softly, gratitude and grief tangling together in her chest in equal measure. "Elena," Mother Superior's voice gentled, "I need to ask you, honestly, where your heart stands now that the danger has passed, now that you've had weeks to consider everything that happened. The final vows ceremony is in 3 weeks. If there is any part of you still uncertain, any part of you that needs more time, I would rather delay the ceremony than see you bind yourself to a vow you cannot keep with your whole heart." The offer, generous and unexpected, nearly undid Elena's careful composure entirely. "I don't know," she admitted, the honesty costing her dearly. "I want to want this with my whole heart, Mother. I want the certainty I had before he came here. But every time I pray for it, every time I try to recommit myself fully to this path, I find his face waiting on the other side of my thoughts. And I don't know how to pray that away without losing something essential about myself in the process." "Then perhaps," Mother Superior said slowly, "the question isn't whether you can pray him away, but whether God is using this very uncertainty to show you something true about the shape your life is meant to take. I cannot answer that question for you, Elena. No one can. But I would caution you, gently, against taking vows simply because the alternative frightens you more than the vows themselves comfort you." Elena sat with that counsel long after Mother Superior had left her alone in the small office, turning the words over and over, recognizing in them both wisdom and warning and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that the 3 weeks remaining before her final vows would require her to answer, finally and completely, the question she had spent her entire devoted life avoiding. What did she actually want, freely and fully, when every external voice telling her what to want fell silent? Cardinal Befani had not survived 3 decades of ecclesiastical politics by allowing inconvenient discoveries to go unexploited. and the confirmation that Damiano Russo had indeed sheltered at Santa Lucia, delivered to him through a combination of careful investigation and a well-placed bribe to one of Salvatore's former associates, now eager to curry favour with whoever held power, represented an opportunity too valuable to waste. He sat now in his private study within the Vatican's labyrinthine corridors, reviewing the information with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just discovered leverage where he'd previously seen only liability. Damiano Russo, reinstated head of the Russo crime family, had a vulnerability that Befani suspected the man himself did not yet fully understand: an attachment to a young nun who happened, by the particular cruelty of circumstance, to be the Holy Father's own daughter. The implications were extraordinary. If word of this connection became public, if anyone discovered that the Pope's daughter had hidden a Mafia boss within her convent, had nursed him back to health through weeks of secret visits, had developed feelings significant enough that even careful investigation revealed traces of their connection in the testimony of the few who knew, the scandal would shake the Church to its foundations. Pope Adrian VII's papacy, still relatively young, still establishing its particular character and priorities, could not survive a controversy of such magnitude. Befani had no particular desire to destroy the Pope's papacy. His ambitions, while considerable, did not extend to outright sabotage of the institution he'd spent his life serving. What he wanted was simpler and, in its way, more dangerous: control. The knowledge he now possessed gave him leverage over both the Pope himself and the reinstated head of one of the city's most powerful crime families, and Befani intended to use that leverage to ensure the lucrative arrangement his predecessor had established with the Russo family continued flowing into accounts he personally controlled, free from any interference Damiano might be tempted to introduce now that he understood the precise nature of what had been happening beneath his family's apparent, legitimate business interests. He arranged the meeting carefully, choosing neutral ground, a private room in a restaurant known for its discretion, far from both the Vatican and the Russo Tower, where two powerful men could speak without the complications of their respective territories. Damiano arrived precisely on time, his expression carved from the careful neutrality he'd perfected over years of dangerous negotiations. Though Befani noted, with the particular attentiveness of a man who'd built his career on reading hidden currents, a tension in the younger man's shoulders that suggested he understood exactly why this meeting had been called. "Cardinal," Damiano said, taking the seat across from Befani without offering the deference his title typically demanded. "I assume you have something specific in mind, given the unusual venue." "I always have something specific in mind, Mr. Russo. It's rather the nature of my position." Befani allowed himself a thin smile. "I understand congratulations are in order regarding your recent reclamation of leadership." "Get to the point, Cardinal. We both have better uses for our time than pleasantries neither of us means." Befani's smile sharpened. "Very well. I'm aware of your time at Santa Lucia. I'm aware, more specifically, of your connection to a particular young sister there, a connection that goes considerably beyond the medical care she provided during your recovery." Damiano's expression did not change, but something in his stillness sharpened, the careful neutrality of a predator assessing a threat. "I don't know what you think you know, Cardinal, but I'd choose my next words very carefully if I were you. I know that Sister Elena Moretti,
is the Holy Father's daughter, Bifani said, watching with satisfaction as the information landed visibly across Damiano's features. Genuine shock, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to hide entirely. I know she hid you, tended your wounds, and developed feelings for you, significant enough that her own Mother Superior had to address the matter directly. I know that should this information become public, it would represent a scandal of historic proportions for the Church, and considerable danger for the young woman herself, given how the more zealous corners of the faithful tend to react to perceived betrayals of consecrated purity. What do you want, Bifani? The words came out clipped, dangerous, all pretense of polite conversation abandoned. Continuity, Bifani said simply. The arrangement your father established, that you've maintained, that flows funds from your organization's various enterprises into accounts that serve the Church's broader interests, and my own, I'll admit, with the honesty I appreciate you've shown me, continues without interruption or renegotiation. In exchange, this information remains entirely confidential. No one need ever know what happened at Santa Lucia, least of all the Holy Father himself, who I imagine would find the knowledge of his daughter's particular entanglement quite distressing. Damiano's jaw tightened, the calculation behind his eyes visible even through his careful control. And if I refuse? Then I imagine the information finds its way to less discreet channels, Bifani said, his tone never losing its pleasant, almost conversational quality, despite the threat embedded within it. Perhaps to journalists who would relish the story of the Pope's daughter and the Mafia boss, perhaps to the more traditional factions within the Vatican, who already view this Pope's papacy with suspicion and would welcome any scandal that might weaken his position. The young woman's reputation, her vows, her entire future within the Church, all of it would be destroyed by the revelation, regardless of how the broader scandal eventually resolves. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, and Bifani watched with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just secured exactly the leverage he'd hoped for, as Damiano Russo, a man who had survived betrayal, war, and near-fatal violence without visible fear, finally showed the unmistakable signs of a man who had discovered something he could not bear to lose, and would do nearly anything to protect. The arrangement continues, Damiano said finally, his voice carrying a controlled fury that promised future reckoning even as he conceded present defeat. But know this, Cardinal. If any harm comes to Elena because of what you know, I will burn your entire career to the ground, regardless of what it costs me. Are we clear? Perfectly clear, Bifani said, rising from the table with the satisfied air of a man whose business had concluded exactly as he'd hoped. I trust we understand each other, Mr. Russo. I have no interest in harming the young woman. I have only interest in ensuring the arrangement that has served us all so well continues uninterrupted. As long as that remains true, her secret remains safe with me. He left Damiano alone at the table, the younger man's hands clenched into fists that betrayed the violence simmering just beneath his careful composure, and felt, walking back toward his waiting car, the particular satisfaction of a man who had just secured his future through the simple, ruthless application of someone else's love. The week before her final vows, Elena found herself standing in the convent's small chapel long after evening prayers had ended, alone in the candle-lit quiet, staring up at the worn fresco of the Annunciation that had watched over Santa Lucia's congregants for centuries.
She had not heard from Damiano since his departure, had received no word, no message, nothing beyond Mother Superior's second-hand confirmation that he had survived his return to the underworld he had been born into. The silence had been its own particular torment. Not because she'd expected him to break it, given everything circumstance demanded of them both, but because the absence of any word left her alone with questions she had no way of resolving. Had what happened between them been real, or had it simply been the particular intimacy of crisis, the kind that frequently mistook itself for love and faded the moment ordinary life reasserted itself? Had he thought of her at all in the weeks since his departure? Or had the demands of reclaiming his empire pushed the memory of a wounded interlude beneath a convent into some forgotten corner of his mind? She did not know, and the not knowing had become its own particular prayer, repeated nightly without resolution. Let me understand my own heart before I bind it forever to something else. You're praying very hard about something, came a voice from the chapel's entrance, and Elena turned to find Mother Superior watching her with the particular gentle concern that had characterized their relationship since the discovery weeks before. I'm trying to find certainty, Elena admitted. It hasn't been particularly cooperative. Mother Superior moved to sit beside her in the chapel's front pew, both women's eyes drawn upward toward the fresco's depiction of an angel delivering impossible news to a young woman who had no way of knowing in that moment the full magnitude of what her acceptance would demand of her. I've been thinking about Mary often these past weeks, Mother Superior said quietly, about the particular courage required to say yes to something so far beyond ordinary comprehension without any certainty of how the story would unfold. That's different, Elena said. She said yes to God's will. I'm trying to determine if my own will and God's will have ever actually aligned, or if I've simply mistaken one for the other my entire life. Perhaps, Mother Superior offered carefully, the two questions aren't as different as they appear. Perhaps determining your own true will is itself a form of discerning God's intention for you, rather than separate from it. Elena was quiet for a long moment, turning the thought over. Mother, may I ask you something difficult? Of course. Have you ever loved someone? Before you took your own vows, I mean. Someone whose absence felt like its own particular grief, even years later. Something shifted across Mother Superior's weathered features. Old memory, carefully banked but not entirely extinguished. Yes, she said simply. There was a young man, before I entered religious life. We were engaged to be married, in fact, until he died in an accident 3 months before our wedding. Elena's breath caught. I never knew that. It's not something I speak of often, but I tell you now because I think you deserve honesty, given the question you're truly asking, beneath the one you've voiced. Mother Superior met her eyes directly. I did not enter religious life to escape that grief, though many assumed as much at the time. I entered because, in the depths of my mourning, I discovered a calling that had nothing to do with what I'd lost, and everything to do with what I'd found. A particular peace, a particular purpose, that existed independent of whether my heart had previously belonged to someone else. How did you know the difference between escaping grief and genuinely finding calling? Time, Mother Superior said simply. I gave myself years before I took my own vows, Elena. Years to grieve fully, to test whether the calling I felt would survive once the rawness of loss had faded into ordinary sorrow. It did. The peace I found in religious life proved durable, not because I'd successfully escaped my grief, but because the calling itself had nothing to do with escape at all. And if my own calling hasn't yet been tested by time, if everything has happened so quickly that I genuinely don't know whether what I feel for the convent is true calling or simply familiar comfort, and what I feel for— Elena stopped herself, unable to fully voice his name even now. For Damiano Russo, Mother Superior finished gently, and Elena flinched at hearing the name spoken aloud in the chapel's sacred quiet. Elena, I think you already know what I'm going to suggest, given everything we've discussed these past weeks. You think I should delay the vows? I think, Mother Superior said carefully, that taking vows you cannot fully commit to with absolute clarity does a disservice not just to yourself, but to the sacrament itself. I think 6 weeks of crisis and revelation, however significant, may not provide sufficient distance to determine whether what you're feeling represents lasting calling or simply circumstance disguised as certainty. I would rather see you delay, take the time you genuinely need, than rush toward a vow you might spend the rest of your life questioning. The suggestion, gentle as it was offered, struck Elena with the force of revelation she hadn't expected, not because it surprised her, but because some part of her had been waiting, for weeks now, for someone with sufficient authority and care to give her permission to admit what she already suspected. She was not ready, might never be entirely certain, and forcing certainty into existence through sheer force of will would only postpone a reckoning that deserved more honesty than that. I need to think, Elena said finally, her voice thick with the particular exhaustion of unresolved truth finally surfacing. I need to think very carefully about what I actually want, free from fear, free from obligation, free from everything except my own honest heart. Take the time you need, Mother Superior said, rising and pressing a gentle kiss to the top of Elena's head, the maternal gesture carrying more comfort than any words could have offered. Whatever you decide, child, know that you are loved here regardless. That has never been, and will never be, conditional on the particular shape your devotion eventually takes. Elena remained alone in the chapel long after Mother Superior departed, staring up at the ancient fresco, feeling for the first time in weeks something close to clarity beginning to surface through the fog of doubt and grief. Not certainty about her ultimate decision, but certainty, finally, that she owed herself the honesty of genuinely choosing, rather than simply inheriting a path she'd never truly tested against the full weight of her own heart's desires. Damiano had kept his distance from Santa Lucia for nearly 2 months, honouring the dangerous calculus of Befani's leverage, understanding that any visible connection between himself and the convent risked exposing exactly the secret he'd promised to protect. But the discipline that had served him through every previous crisis in his life began, in the weeks approaching Elena's final vows, to fray beyond his ability to maintain it. He told himself he was simply checking in, ensuring no further threats had materialized around the convent's grounds, that his interest remained purely strategic rather than personal. He told himself this while driving towards Santa Lucia's familiar gravel road on a grey Tuesday afternoon, while parking his car at a discreet distance and approaching the convent's grounds through the same wooded path he'd used countless times during his recovery. While standing at the edge of the property, watching the convent's stone walls with an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his long-healed wounds, he had not intended to be seen. He had certainly not intended for Elena herself to be the one who found him, walking the wooded perimeter during what should have been her private contemplative hour, but circumstance, or perhaps something less coincidental than circumstance, arranged otherwise. Damiano. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a complicated mixture of shock and something that looked dangerously close to relief. He turned, and the sight of her, dressed in her habit, dark hair mostly hidden beneath her wimple, but her face exactly as he remembered it, exactly as he'd dreamed it during too many restless nights, nearly undid every careful resolution he'd maintained since their parting. "I shouldn't be here," he said, though he made no move to leave. "I know that. I needed to see that you were safe. I'm safe," she said softly, moving closer, despite every instinct that should have warned her against it. "Are you? I heard you reclaimed your position. I heard the danger had passed." "The immediate danger, yes, but there are always new complications in my world." He hesitated, watching her face carefully, deciding in that moment not to burden her with the full weight of Bafani's leverage, with the particular danger that his very presence here represented to her safety and reputation alike. "How are you?" "Your final vows. They're soon, aren't they?" "4 days," she said, and something in her voice made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't fully name. "I've delayed them once already. Mother Superior thought I needed more time to be certain." "And are you certain?" The question hung between them, heavy with everything neither of them had said in the 2 months since his departure. Elena's eyes filled with tears she did not bother concealing, the rawness of her expression more honest than anything she'd allowed herself to show him before. "No," she admitted, the confession costing her visibly. "I'm not certain of anything anymore, Damiano. Not since you came into my life and showed me how much uncertainty I'd been carrying without ever acknowledging it. I've prayed every single day for clarity. And every single day I find your face waiting at the center of whatever clarity I manage to find." He closed the distance between them before either of them could think better of it, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that belied every violent instinct he'd built his entire life around. "I've thought about you every day too," he confessed, the admission tearing loose something he'd kept carefully restrained for 2 months. "I told myself it would fade. I told myself the connection between us was just circumstance, just crisis dressed up as something deeper. It hasn't faded, Elena. If anything, it's grown sharper, more impossible to ignore the longer I've stayed away." "Then why did you stay away?" The question carried genuine hurt beneath its surface. 2 months, Damiano, not a single word." He hesitated, the weight of Bafani's threat pressing against his desire to be fully honest with her. "Because staying away was the only way I knew to protect you," he said finally, choosing partial truth over the full danger he couldn't yet reveal. "My world is dangerous, Elena. The men who hunted me, the enemies I've made reclaiming my position, any connection to you puts you at risk. I have no right to ask you to bear." "And yet here you are," she said softly, "risking exactly that, simply by standing in this clearing with me now." "I couldn't stay away any longer," he admitted. I told myself I could, that discipline would win out over whatever this is between us. I was wrong. 2 months of staying away taught me only that distance doesn't diminish what I feel for you, Elena. It only makes the wanting sharper. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch with a vulnerability that nearly broke his careful control entirely. "I'm supposed to take my final vows in 4 days," she whispered. "I'm supposed to bind myself to God forever, and all I can think about is the particular weight of your hands against my face, the sound of your voice, the way you make me question everything I've spent 18 years believing about my own heart's true direction." "Don't take the vows," he said, the words escaping before he could fully consider their wisdom. "Not because of me, or not only because of me, but because you deserve to choose your life freely, without the particular pressure of inherited obligation clouding your judgment. Take more time. Test your calling against genuine freedom, not against fear of disappointing everyone who's invested in your devotion. And if I take that time and discover my calling remains true regardless, then I'll have lost you to something genuinely greater than myself," he said, his voice rough with an honesty that cost him considerably to offer. "And as much as that would destroy me, Helena, I'd rather lose you to genuine calling than win you through fear or obligation disguised as devotion." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with an intensity that seemed to see straight through every careful wall he'd built around his heart since childhood. "That's the most selfless thing you've ever said to me," she murmured. "I didn't know you had it in you." "Neither did I," he admitted. "Apparently you bring out depths I didn't know existed." They stood together in the wooded clearing for a long moment, neither willing to be the first to break the fragile connection between them, both understanding with painful clarity that whatever happened next would shape not just their own futures, but the precarious balance of secrets and danger surrounding them both. Neither of them yet knew that their conversation, conducted in what they'd believed was perfect privacy, had been observed from a distance by eyes belonging to one of Salvatore Greco's former associates, a man now eager to sell whatever information might restore his standing with whichever power proved most generous, regardless of the devastating cost that information might exact on two people who had finally, after months of careful denial, allowed themselves to speak the truth of what they felt. The information reached Pope Adrian VII 3 days before his daughter's scheduled final vows, delivered through channels that bypassed Cardinal Befani's careful control entirely. A journalist with a reputation for uncovering Vatican scandals, who had purchased the photograph from Salvatore's opportunistic former associate, and now sought confirmation before publishing a story that would shake the Church to its foundations. Adrian read the brief, accompanied by a grainy but unmistakable photograph of his daughter and a man he recognized, after a moment's horrified research, as Damiano Russo, head of one of the city's most notorious crime families, standing close together in what was unmistakably an intimate conversation, in a wooded clearing near Santa Lucia's grounds, and felt the particular vertigo of a man whose careful world had just shifted beneath his feet entirely. He called Santa Lucia immediately, his voice carrying none of his usual measured calm when Mother Superior answered. "I need to speak with my daughter," he said without preamble, "now, if possible, and I need you to tell me, honestly, everything you know about her connection to a man named Damiano Russo." Mother Superior's careful silence, before she finally began explaining the events of the past months, told Adrian everything he needed to know about the gravity of what he was about to confront. Elena arrived at the small office reserved for video calls within the hour, her face pale with dread the moment she saw her father's expression on the screen, an expression she had never witnessed before in 18 years of knowing him, carrying none of the warmth she associated with their relationship, only a profound, exhausted concern. "Elena," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the visible strain beneath it. "I need you to tell me the truth, all of it, about Damiano Russo." She told him everything. The warehouse purge, the wounded man in the cellar chamber, the weeks of secret care that had grown into something neither of them had anticipated or sought. The impossible feelings that had nearly derailed her entire life's calling. She told him about Mother Superior's discovery, about the delayed vows, about the conversation in the wooded clearing days before that had apparently been photographed by someone with malicious intent. Adrian listened in silence, his expression cycling through shock, grief, and something that looked, by the conversation's end, almost like helpless sorrow. "Elena," he said finally, "do you understand what's about to happen?" A journalist has this information, a photograph. Within days, possibly hours, this story will become public. The Pope's daughter, nun, secretly nursing a Mafia boss back to health, developing feelings for him that nearly prevented her final vows. The scandal alone could destabilize my entire papacy. There are factions within the Church who have been searching for exactly this kind of vulnerability since the day I was elected. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, the magnitude of the consequences crashing over her fully for the first time. "I never meant for any of this to threaten you, Father. I only meant to save a dying man's life." "I know," Adrian said, his voice gentling despite the crisis surrounding them both. "I know, Elena. And whatever judgment the world chooses to pass on this situation, know that your father's love for you has never been contingent on the perfection of your choices. But I need you to understand the full weight of what's coming, so we can decide together how best to navigate it." "What do you need me to do?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options that all carried significant cost. "I need to know, honestly, what you feel for this man. Not what you think you should feel, not what fear or obligation might be telling you to feel, but the genuine truth of your heart. Because the path forward depends entirely on that truth. And I won't ask you to sacrifice your genuine happiness simply to protect my own position." The question, asked with such evident love despite the crisis surrounding them, broke something loose in Elena that she'd been holding carefully contained for months. "I love him," she said, the words finally spoken aloud with full clarity for the first time. "I don't know how it happened, or whether it makes any sense given everything that separates our worlds, but I love him, Father, more than I've ever loved anything beyond my faith itself." Something in Adrian's expression shifted. Grief, certainly, given everything that confession meant for the careful future he'd imagined for his daughter. But beneath the grief, something that looked almost like relief at finally hearing genuine truth rather than careful performance. "Then we need to determine," he said slowly, "whether your faith and this love can coexist, or whether you must choose definitively between them, and we need to determine it quickly, before the world makes that choice for you, through scandal and speculation rather than honest discernment." Within hours of that conversation, the story broke. Not through the journalist's original intended publication, which Adrian's careful diplomatic channels managed to delay by mere days, but through Salvatore's former associate, selling the same information to a second outlet, eager to capitalize on competing bidders for a scandal this significant. By morning, every major news outlet carried some version of the story. The Pope's secret daughter, a cloistered nun on the verge of her final vows, romantically entangled with a notorious crime boss she had hidden and nursed back to health within her own convent's hallowed walls. The faithful expressed shock and betrayal in equal measure. The Church's more conservative factions called for immediate, severe consequences, and somewhere in the chaos of a scandal exploding across every available media channel, Damiano Russo received word of the exposure through his own network, understanding immediately the full danger now facing both himself and the woman he loved more than he'd believed himself capable of loving anyone. He called Santa Lucia immediately, demanding to speak with Elena directly, his voice carrying a fury and fear that surprised even Tomas, who had never witnessed his employer this thoroughly unguarded. "Elena," he said the moment she answered, "are you safe? Has anyone threatened you?" "I'm safe," she said, though her voice carried the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent the morning fielding increasingly hostile calls from church officials demanding explanation. "But Damiano, everything's exposed now. Everyone knows. My father's papacy is in genuine danger because of choices I made." "This isn't your fault," he said fiercely. "You saved a dying man's life. That's not a sin worth destroying anyone's career over." "Try telling that to the cardinals currently calling for my expulsion from religious life entirely," Eleanor said, bitter humour edging into her exhausted voice. "Or to the journalists camping outside the convent gates, hoping for a glimpse of the scandalous nun." "Tell me where you are," Damiano said, his voice hardening with sudden resolve. "I'm coming to get you. Whatever happens next, you shouldn't have to face it alone, surrounded by people questioning your every choice. Damiano, if you come here, if you're seen with me again, it only makes everything worse." "I don't care about worse," he said. "I care about you facing this alone when I could be standing beside you instead. Let me come, Elena. Please. Whatever this scandal costs us both, let's at least face the cost together, rather than separately." The offer, fierce and unguarded in a way she'd never heard from him before, settled something in Elena's chest, despite the chaos surrounding them both. A certainty, finally crystallizing through months of doubt, that whatever the world's judgment of their connection, the connection itself was real, was worth defending, and was not something either of them intended to abandon simply because circumstance had finally, brutally, exposed it to the light. Damiano arrived at Santa Lucia by evening, driving directly through the small crowd of journalists gathered at the convent's gates with the particular ruthless efficiency that had served him throughout his entire dangerous career, ignoring the flashing cameras and shouted questions as he made his way toward the convent's main entrance. Mother Superior met him at the door, her expression carrying none of the wariness he might have expected, given everything the scandal had cost her community's careful privacy. "Sister Elena is in the chapel," she said simply. "She's been there most of the day, trying to find some clarity amid all this chaos. I imagine she'd welcome your company, given everything circumstance has finally forced into the open." He found her exactly where Mother Superior had indicated, kneeling in the chapel's front pew, her face turned upward
toward the ancient fresco of the Annunciation, tears tracking silently down her cheeks despite her evident effort to maintain composure. "Eleanor?" She turned at the sound of his voice, and the relief that flooded her expression at the sight of him told him everything he needed to know about how desperately she'd needed someone, needed him specifically, through the brutal exposure of the past day. "You came," she whispered, rising to meet him as he crossed the chapel's length toward her. "I told you I would." He gathered her into his arms, feeling the particular tremor of exhausted grief running through her body, holding her with a tenderness that felt, in this sacred space, almost like its own form of prayer.
"I'm so sorry, Eleanor. Sorry this scandal has cost you so much. Sorry I couldn't protect you from the consequences of caring for me." "Don't apologize for that," she said fiercely, pulling back enough to meet his eyes. "I don't regret saving your life, Damiano. I don't regret anything that's happened between us, even now, even with everything it's cost. Even with your father's papacy at risk? Even with the church calling for your expulsion?" "Even with all of that," she confirmed, though grief shadowed her words. "I spoke with my father again, an hour ago. He's facing calls for resignation from certain factions, accusations that he's unfit to lead given his daughter's scandal. The damage is significant, Damiano. I don't know if his papacy survives this." "What does he say?" "About us. About what should happen now." Eleanor's expression carried complicated layers of grief and something that looked almost like wonder. "He says he loves me, regardless of my choices. He says he won't ask me to sacrifice genuine happiness simply to preserve his political position, even given everything currently at stake. He says—" She paused, visibly steadying herself. "He says, faith was never meant to be a cage, Damiano. He says, if what I feel for you is genuine love, rather than rebellion or confusion, then perhaps God brought us together for reasons neither of us yet fully understand, and that forcing myself into vows I cannot keep with my whole heart would dishonour the sacrament far more than honestly choosing a different path." "He's giving you permission to choose me," Damiano said, something like disbelief colouring his voice. "He's giving me permission to choose myself," Elena corrected gently, "whatever that ultimately means. He's not telling me to abandon the convent for you specifically. He's telling me to finally, honestly determine what my own heart actually wants, free from every external pressure that shaped my choices since I was 8 years old." "And what does your heart want?" The question came out rough, urgent, carrying the full weight of months of careful restraint, finally giving way to honest desperation. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his chest ache. "I want you," she said finally, the confession trembling but certain. "I've tried to want something else, tried to convince myself that the calling I felt before you came was more real than what I feel for you now, and I can't make myself believe it anymore. I love you, Damiano. I don't know what that means for my faith, for my relationship with God, for the entire architecture of the life I expected to live. But I know it's true, and I'm done pretending otherwise, simply because it frightens me." He kissed her then, in the chapel's sacred quiet, beneath the watchful gaze of an ancient fresco depicting an angel's impossible announcement to a young woman who had no certainty how her own story would unfold. Kissed her
with everything he'd held carefully restrained since the night he first saw her face by candlelight in a hidden chamber beneath these very walls, with months of longing and fear and impossible hope finally given voice through the simple, devastating act of two mouths finally meeting after countless reasons to keep them apart.
When they finally separated, both breathing hard, both shaking with the magnitude of what had just been spoken between them, Elena pressed her forehead against his chest and allowed herself, finally, to simply exist within the certainty of her own choice without flinching from its consequences. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "To us, to my father, to everything this scandal has set in motion?" "I don't know," Damiano admitted, his arms tightening around her protectively. "But whatever happens, you won't face it alone. I promise you that, Elena. Whatever else my promises are worth, coming from a man who spent his whole life breaking every law except the ones written in blood." "Your promises are worth everything to me," she said, "precisely because you're not a man who makes them easily. I trust the weight you give them." Their moment of fragile peace shattered within minutes as Thomas burst into the chapel with an urgency that immediately sharpened Damiano's protective instincts. "Boss, we have a problem. Bifani's people, they're moving against you. He's furious about the exposure, says you broke the agreement by being seen with her again, and he's threatening to expose everything about the financial arrangement between your family and the church, unless you make this disappear immediately." "Make what disappear?" Damiano's voice had gone cold, dangerous. "Elena? Is he threatening her?" "He's threatening everyone," Thomas said grimly. "There's worse, though. Bifani's been in contact with some of Salvatore's old associates, men who never fully accepted your return to power. He's offering to fund a new challenge to your leadership if you don't find a way to control this scandal immediately." Damiano's expression hardened into the particular cold fury Elena had witnessed only once before, during the desperate hours of his recovery when he'd spoken of Salvatore's betrayal. "Bifani's playing a dangerous game," he said quietly, "one he doesn't fully understand the stakes of." "What are you going to do?" Elena asked, fear threading through her voice, despite her attempts to remain composed. "What I should have done months ago," Damiano said, turning to face her with an expression that carried equal parts protective fury and absolute resolve. "I'm going to end this threat permanently. Not through violence, Elena, I promise you that, but through exposure of my own. Bifani's corruption, the decades of laundered funds, the arrangement that's compromised the church's integrity since before I was even born. If he wants to play with scandal, I'll show him exactly how thoroughly that game can be turned against him. That could destroy the church's reputation entirely. It could destroy my father's papacy alongside Bifani's career. Or, Damiano said carefully, it could finally cleanse something that's been rotting at the church's foundations for decades, and give your father the opportunity to address corruption that predates his own papacy entirely, positioning him as a reformer rather than merely a man whose daughter caused scandal." He met her eyes steadily. "The choice isn't mine to make alone, Elena. It affects your father, your faith, your entire community. But I won't let Bifani use either of us as leverage any longer. Whatever path we choose, it ends with us standing in truth, rather than continuing to live beneath the weight of someone else's manipulation." The confrontation that ended Cardinal Bifani's 3 decades of careful corruption unfolded not through violence, but through the precise, devastating application of truth, a strategy Pope Adrian VII himself ultimately endorsed Once Damiano and Elena presented him with the full evidence Damiano's network had spent careful days compiling. Adrian called an emergency session of the College of Cardinals, presenting documentation of the Fani's decades of financial manipulation with the same measured gravity he brought to every significant decision of his papacy. The revelation, when it came, shocked even cardinals who had long suspected Bafani's particular ambitions exceeded appropriate boundaries. Decades of laundered criminal funds, properties acquired through compromised arrangements, influence purchased through channels that had nothing to do with genuine faith or service. Bafani's removal from the College of Cardinals followed within days, his career ending not in the dramatic scandal he'd hoped to weaponize against the Pope's daughter, but in the quiet, comprehensive collapse of decades of carefully constructed corruption finally exposed to unforgiving light. The broader scandal regarding Elena and Damiano did not disappear entirely. Some damage, Adrian acknowledged privately, could never be fully undone. But it transformed, in the weeks following Bafani's fall, from simple, salacious gossip into something more complicated and, ultimately, more redemptive. A story about a pope who chose honesty over political convenience, about a daughter who chose genuine faith over performed certainty, about love that had emerged from the most unlikely circumstances and proven, despite every reason to doubt it, genuinely transformative for everyone it touched. Elena did not take her final vows that season, nor the season after. She remained at Santa Lucia for several months following the scandal's resolution, working through the complicated process of discerning what her faith actually demanded of her now that fear and inherited obligation no longer clouded the question. And discovered, through that careful discernment, that her love for God had never actually required the particular shape of vowed religious life to remain genuine and profound. "I think," she told Damiano, during one of his now frequent visits to Santa Lucia's grounds, no longer conducted in secret, but with the cautious blessing of both Mother Superior and her father, "that I can serve God fully without becoming a nun. That my faith doesn't require the particular sacrifice I once believed was its only legitimate expression." "What does that mean for us?" Damiano asked, watching her face carefully in the late afternoon light, the same wooded clearing where their connection had first been exposed, now feeling, oddly, like sacred ground in its own right. "It means I'm choosing to leave the convent," Elena said, "not because I've lost my faith, but because I've finally found the courage to determine what my faith actually requires of me, separate from every expectation placed upon me before I was old enough to choose for myself." "And what does it require?" She smiled, the particular warmth of it carrying none of the uncertainty that had characterized their early conversations months before. "It requires honesty," she said. "Genuine choice, freely made. It requires me to love you, Damiano, not in spite of my faith, but as an expression of everything I believe about mercy, redemption, and the possibility of grace, even in the most unlikely circumstances." He kissed her then, in the same clearing where everything had nearly fallen apart months before, with a tenderness that carried none of the desperate urgency of their earlier encounters, only the steady, certain warmth of two people who had finally chosen each other freely, without the shadow of secrecy or fear darkening the choice. "I have something to tell you," he said when they finally separated, his expression carrying a vulnerability she'd rarely witnessed from him. "Something I haven't told anyone, not even Thomas." "What is it?" "I've started attending Mass," he admitted, the confession costing him visibly despite months of genuine transformation. Not because I suddenly believe everything the church teaches without question, but because watching you, watching the way your faith shapes genuine compassion, genuine mercy, even toward a man who once told you he didn't believe in anything beyond power, it's made me wonder if maybe I dismissed something significant before I ever genuinely examined it. Damiano. Elena's eyes filled with tears, the genuine wonder of his admission landing with profound weight. I never asked you to believe. I never wanted you to change your convictions simply to please me. I know, he said. That's exactly why I'm telling you now. Because this isn't about pleasing you. It's about genuinely questioning whether the cold mathematics I built my entire life around ever actually answered the questions that matter most. You saved my life, Elena. Not just physically, in that chamber beneath the convent, but in every sense that actually matters. You showed me mercy I'd never experienced, devotion I'd never witnessed, and a kind of strength that has nothing to do with violence or power. I don't know yet what I believe about God specifically, but I believe in whatever brought you into my life, whatever made a nun choose to save a dying criminal's life instead of walking away. If that's God's grace working through you, then I suppose I believe in grace, even if the rest of the theology remains genuinely uncertain to me. She held him close, feeling the particular miracle of his honesty settle over them both, understanding that whatever shape their future ultimately took, marriage, partnership, some configuration neither of them could yet fully predict, the foundation they'd built through crisis, doubt, and finally honest choice represented something far more durable than the certainty either of them had once mistakenly believed was the only legitimate form devotion could take. 6 months later, in a small ceremony attended by Mother Superior, by several of the sisters who had become genuine friends to Elena during her years at Santa Lucia, and by Pope Adrian VII himself, who insisted on personally blessing his daughter's marriage, despite the complicated politics still surrounding his papacy's recovery from scandal. Elena Moretti married Damiano Russo in the same small chapel where they had first kissed, beneath the same ancient fresco of the Annunciation that had witnessed every stage of their impossible journey from stranger to saviour to genuine, freely chosen love. Damiano had, by then, begun the slow, complicated process of transforming his family's enterprises toward legitimate business interests, a transition Tomas managed with careful pragmatism, while Damiano himself devoted increasing attention to charitable work that Elena had gently, persistently encouraged. Work that included, with a particular symmetry neither of them found accidental, significant funding for Santa Lucia's continued operation, and a foundation dedicated to supporting women who had survived violence within the very criminal world Damiano had once ruled absolutely. He had not become a saint, would likely never fully shed the particular hardness that decades of violence had carved into his character. But standing in that small chapel, watching Elena walk toward him in simple white rather than her familiar black habit, her dark eyes bright with a certainty that had finally, genuinely become her own rather than inherited from anyone else's expectations, Damiano Russo understood, with absolute clarity, that he had found something in that hidden chamber beneath Santa Lucia far more valuable than mere survival. He had found redemption, not through doctrine or vows, but through the simple, devastating mercy of a woman who had looked at a dying, blasphemous criminal and chosen, against every reasonable instinct, to save him anyway, and in doing so, had saved far more than his physical life. She had shown him, through months of patient honesty and fierce, unwavering compassion, that even the most hardened sinner remained capable of genuine transformation, that even the coldest mathematics of power and survival could yield, eventually, to something far more powerful. Love, freely given, freely chosen, and freely returned. "I love you," he whispered, as she reached him at the altar, the words carrying none of the calculated caution that had governed every previous relationship in his violent, careful life. "Beyond anything I thought myself capable of feeling. Beyond every wall I spent my whole life building." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered back, her hand finding his with the same steady certainty she'd shown that first terrifying night, candlelight flickering across her face as she knelt beside a dying stranger and chose, against every reasonable fear, to save him. "I think I loved you from the very first night, even before I understood what that love would eventually cost or what it would ultimately give us both in return." Outside the chapel, spring had finally settled fully over Santa Lucia's grounds, the same wooded paths where their connection had first been exposed, now blooming with the particular abundance that follows a long, difficult winter. A quiet, persistent testament to the truth Elena had finally embraced after months of doubt and fear. That grace, genuine and transformative, often arrives in the most unlikely forms, beneath the most unlikely circumstances, and asks only the simple, terrifying courage of choosing it freely, regardless of how impossible that choice might once have seemed. The devil and the saint, the sinner and the sacred, had found, against every reasonable expectation, not destruction, but redemption in each other's arms. Proof, perhaps, that the most profound miracles rarely announce themselves with the clarity faith traditionally demands, but instead arrive quietly, in hidden chambers and candlelit dark, waiting patiently for two broken, searching hearts to recognize what had been offered them all along. The simple, devastating grace of being truly, fully known and loved regardless.